What Keynes mainly did, he explained a specific situation, which was the world economic crisis. He fitted his model to this crisis and derived the policy implication. Okay? And in this way, Keynes is asymmetric because the Keynes just focused on the crisis. And only later on, after World War II, a Keynesian economic theory is developed, which is in a way symmetric, which is dealing with boom, with bust and boom, and which is developing a theory which is symmetric, which says save in the boom and spend in the bust. But this is not Keynes, which is Keynesian theory, a theory being based on Keynesian thoughts. And others. Okay, so we have discussed intensively the role of credit for boom and bust in financial markets. And now in the second lecture, we will discuss the role of monetary policy for imbalances and crises. And the first step we will do is to understand why monetary policy making has turned out to be asymmetric. So in the Hayekian model, as you have seen, monetary policy acts in a symmetric way. It makes mistakes both in boom and crisis. But what turns out since the mid-1980s, is an asymmetric pattern. And we will try to identify these asymmetric patterns based on the definitions of monetary policy mistakes by Hayek, and then move on to the implications for financial stability and to the question if authorities, as suggested and demanded by Minsky, are able to control for financial risk. Because one very important implication of Minsky, and many economists nowadays implicitly acknowledging that cheap money causes exuberance, they rely on financial regulation in order to prevent this exuberance. And we will see that this is, at least from a political economy point of view, not possible. We will see why this is the case. 2 readings. My paper is also here in your material. The paper will describe this asymmetric monetary macroeconomic policy patterns, and also the paper of Van Bernanke, which was very important in order to describe why monetary policy was behaving so well. At least this was a belief until 2008, and since then the major revision concerning this point of view. So, as we already stressed, there are not only shocks in financial markets in emerging market economies, and now more and more will also take place in the industrialized countries, in the United States, in Japan, and the euro area. And once a crisis occurs, it has a global scope, because financial institutions are usually very strongly intertwined, and when one financial institution is in trouble, there's also a big probability that other financial institutions are in trouble, and usually it's very difficult to trace the linkages between financial institutions. The financial links are very diversified and very complex and very hard to understand for regulators. Once we have the crisis, the scale of crisis is very large, and therefore also the monetary policy response is increasing. So we have an unprecedented scope of monetary expansion. We have discussed before the different perceptions about the origins of the shocks. Keynes exogenous, Minsky theory, in a way, it's also endogenous, and it's of course also endogenous in the theories of Hayek and Mises. What is important in the perception of the crises as exogenous shocks is major works now here provided by Summers, who argues that the gradual fall of the equilibrium interest rate or neutral interest rate or natural interest rate, however you call it, is not due to policy action, it's due to changing structural factors in the economies of industrialized countries. So one, in his view, is increasing savings because of aging societies. So the very argument is the societies are aging in the industrialized countries, and because they are aging, they save more. So there's an increasing supply of savings. And the very old argument that all good investment projects have been depleted already, and therefore there are only low return investment projects being left, and for this very reason the investments are declining, and therefore the equilibrium interest rates continues to go down and also theoretically can become negative. And then all what the central banks are doing is just adjusting to this secular decline of the equilibrium or natural interest rate, however you want to call that. So having said this, we want to focus from an Austrian perspective on the asymmetric path in monetary policy making, so the gradual interest rate cuts towards zero. And since then, the inflation of the central bank balance sheets, of course, go in cycles. And in order to derive this path, you can define now, based on the Austrian theory, different policy mistakes. And you have learned from the previous lecture that we have two types of policy mistakes. The one is that during the boom, you keep the interest rate comparatively low, too low, compared to the benchmark of a natural interest rate, and during the crisis, too high compared to the benchmark of the natural interest rate, and that causes the upswing and also aggravates the downswing, as we have learned before. So we can summarize this as follows. Yeah. So first, during the upswing, the central bank keeps the interest rate below the natural interest rate for too long. Yeah. So in the literature, meanwhile, you also find the notion too low for too long. And in the graph we had before here, the central bank interest rate was substantially below the natural interest rate, and that triggered the overinvestment cycle, which was accompanied by exuberance in the financial markets. And of course, the amplitude of boom and bust in financial markets is usually much larger than in the real sector of the economy. And therefore, the crisis also is larger in the financial markets compared to the goods markets. When we had the type 2 monetary policy mistake, here the interest rate is held too high during downswings on the graph on central bank interest rate, and therefore the interest rate prevailing in the capital market was larger than the natural interest rate, and this aggravated the crisis. And as I said before, this is a major criticism of Milton Friedman, and Bernd Bernanke later on picks up this criticism concerning the behavior of the Fed in response to the Black Friday, to the start of the world economic crisis in the 1930s, that the Fed has hesitated too long in order to cut the interest rate. They have kept the interest rate high in order to deflate the bubble. Something similar happened in Japan in the early 1990s. This aggravated the crisis, and this is then identified as a very reason for the long persistence of the crisis, because in the 1930s, there's no real economic recovery. Yeah, and finally, the whole crisis ends with the end of World War II. And of course, World War II also can be understood as a result out of a crisis, because if you have a bad economic development, increasing unemployment, and so on, you have a larger incentive to wage war in order to solve the political problems being linked to that. As if the crisis is prolonged for a very long time, this favors political polarization and so on, and this increases the likelihood that people gain power which regard war as a stable exit strategy from the crisis. So the policy implication now being drawn from these findings from the world economic crisis is that you should cut the interest rate very fast as soon as a crisis occurs, and you should respond very fast to the crisis. And now a very new element in crisis therapy emerges, interestingly, because for a very long time in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the notion was very strong, and that's also again based on Keynesian economic theory, that you have a crisis, you have to increase public spending. Yeah, that was the crisis theory, which was regarded as the most efficient one. And it turns out in the 1970s that stabilizing the economy with additional government spending is not an easy task for several reasons. So the first reason is that usually the pockets of the governments are empty, so they have nothing to spend in the crisis, so they have to raise debt, and raising debt is linked to conflicts. In specific, if the debt level is already high, and even if the parliament allows you to increase debt and increase spending, when you have a strategy to spend the money, yeah. So think about big construction projects. You can observe here in Germany that they sometimes have ideas on how to spend money in the course of big construction projects, but the planning and implementation of construction process is very, very slow. Yeah. So once you have done the planning, you are already had 3 or 4 business cycles. Meanwhile, so it's not really a good thing in order to cure the crisis. And therefore, starting from the 1980s, increasingly the idea is use monetary policy in order to stabilize the economies in a case of a crisis. And also the step-by-step, the nature of the crisis is changing as capital markets get developed, and as capital markets are growing, the crisis more and more shows up as financial crisis, not as economic crisis originating in the real sector of the economy. And now the institutions which are regarded to be able to deal best with financial crisis are all of a sudden central banks. Yeah, and when crisis occurs, in specific in financial market, the crisis occurs very sudden. All of a sudden, stock prices drop very sharply, and then somebody has to respond fast. Yeah, and of course, it's not the government which is able to respond fast. It's usually the central bank which is responding fast. And now the whole discussion, because of course financial crisis is very dramatic, or at least is regarded as very dramatic. All the discussion is how now central bank can deal with crisis, and the conclusion is if you have crisis, you have to cut the interest rate, yeah, very sharply, and you have to flood the financial markets with cheap liquidity in order to stabilize them. Yeah, then if you regard the issue from a symmetric point of view, you should also have a strategy how to exit from the interest rate cut or from the flooding of financial market with cheap liquidity. But this discussion mainly does not occur with the argument you have mentioned before. The very argument is as soon as we increase interest rates or if we tighten liquidity conditions, this is bad for the economic recovery, and therefore it might be best not to increase interest rates at all. Yeah, and then voila, you have a kind of asymmetric pattern with respect to the attitude of central banks towards the business cycle. You move towards very decisive monetary expansion during the crisis, but you have no concept how you exit from this monetary expansion after recovery or during the recovery after the boom. Yeah. So if we put these attitudes in the scheme which we used before in order to model the business cycle, we have two types of reaction, how you can respond to the crisis. The one is Austrian in a way, and the other one is Keynesian inspired in a way. And the Austrian inspired response pattern, optimal response pattern, could be like the following. And we know that once a financial crisis occurs, there's a kind of panic. Yeah, so there's understood there's a lot of risk in the credit provision of banks, and the banks have to reduce this risk, and therefore they tighten credit provision. And if they tighten credit provision, they increase the interest rate. Yeah, here for instance for IC3 dash. And if they increase the interest rate, of course, they cause a negative impact on the economy, because interest is more, money is more expensive, credit is more expensive, less investment projects can be realized, because a high interest rate means that there are only few investment projects with a higher expected return, and this will strongly slow down economic growth and cause a lot of unemployment. Yeah, and if we acknowledge that the panic in the financial sector drives the interest rate above the natural interest rate, in the view of the Austrian overinvestment theory, there is scale for interest rate cuts. Yeah, and of course the interest rate cuts will be not done by the commercial banks, because the risk assessment has dramatically changed by the commercial banks, and from their point of view, it's rational to keep credit provision tight, but the central bank could step in and cut the central bank interest rates to the point where then the interest rate prevailing in the capital market would be pushed to the natural interest rate. Yeah, that would be a kind of intermediate solution. Of course, there would be a quite a cleansing effect. Yeah. Investment projects with an expected return below this ICB4A would have to be dismantled anyway. That would have a negative impact on the economic development. But on the other side, all these investment projects which would have been dismantled because of panic of financial markets could survive. Yeah, so the cleansing effect would be reduced but not eliminated. Yeah, there would be still a recession, but the recession would not be as severe if you would allow panic in financial markets to shoot the interest rates really up. So that would be the optimum Austrian solution. That's of course now interpretation based on Hayek, and that's not something which is explicitly elaborated by Hayek here in this way. Yeah, but what we observe is more the Keynesian view here, and now the central banks tend to overreact. Yeah, they of course they don't know where the natural interest rate is, but they have a strong inclination to cut the interest rate below the new natural interest rate, because not only the commercial banks panic, also the central banks seem to panic. And there's a very decisive intervention of central banks in the financial markets. They strongly cut interest rates, and they flood the financial markets with cheap liquidity in order to prevent the financial crisis. Yeah, and this is modeled in this graph here. So this is again the interest rate which would prevail given the panic in the financial sector. Now the central bank responds and pushes the interest rates down, but below the natural interest rates. For instance, here at the level CB4B, and this would be equivalent to IC4B, and this is now below the new natural interest rate. And now you can imagine what the implication is. What is the implication? a new cycle sets in, a new overinvestment cycle sets in at an even lower interest rate level, and therefore the gap between saving and investment is even larger. Yeah, so now at this point here, we could also imagine that because liquidity conditions are now very benign, the investment curve is shifted to the right because of the very strong interest rate cuts of the central bank, and then you would end up with a situation where you have this amount of saving. Yeah, here the saving curve cuts the interest rate level of the central bank and prevailing in capital markets, and we have even a larger investment volume. And the very large new investment volume is the very strategy of the central bank to stabilize the economic development. Yeah, so now in the short term, the credit provision is stabilized. You have even new and more investment projects, and this is driving the upswing again. Yeah? And now, in the short term, you have ensured the economic recovery, but
because for all these new investments again are with investments that are not efficiently allocated to the consumer needs in the future, because they the consumers again did not save enough to buy all these investments in the future.
Right. So the potential for future crisis has substantially increased again, and the structural distortions prevailing in the economy are even larger. Yeah. So you can prevent the big bust, but the cost, yeah, of this crisis therapy have substantially increased compared to the previous situation. Yeah. And of course, the costs of increasing the interest rates have increased as well. Yeah. And therefore, the exit from the low interest rate strategy of the central bank has become even more improbable. Yeah.
How do you make a distinction? Which one is the? If neither of the models know which one is the neutral interest rate. So when you're trying to go by with the Austrian style, we might end up doing the Keynesian style. When
yes,
because you don't know, neither of the options know the real answer to that.
Right. So theoretically, it's clear. Yeah. But applying these models to the reality, nobody knows what's right and wrong. Yeah, because we don't know the natural interest rate. But from an Austrian perspective, as soon as the interest rate is zero or negative, the Austrians would argue now you have clearly gone too far because this is not possible. Yeah. But of course, to match it with reality, these are just two different scenarios. Yeah. The Austrians would argue this is the real scenario, which we observe in the real world, but others would say this is a real scenario. Yeah. And this cannot be proven. Yeah. And the attitude of modern macroeconomics is we move ahead with a certain policy strategy, and if you want to prevent us from doing that, you have to prove that this strategy is wrong. Yeah. And if you cannot prove that this strategy is wrong, we will continue to follow this strategy. But it's impossible to prove that the strategy is wrong, and the implication is that the policymakers will continue to follow this asymmetric monetary policy. Yeah, that's the clear implication, because if you criticize that, they would argue, before you criticize us, you have to prove that we are wrong. Yeah, and I cannot prove it, so I'm not allowed to criticize that. So that's the main rationale, and how the discussions on monetary policy evolve on academic platforms. Yeah. So that's reaction. Yeah, an appropriate reaction, but the core problem is that we don't know what the natural interest rate is, and there's overreaction. Yeah. And now what is very interesting in the context of overreaction is the political economy explanations. Yeah. So of course, the errors of the central bankers might be random. Yeah. Also in the Hayekian models, the errors can be random, but at the same time, you could argue this is a political economy problem. Yeah, as we will discuss it this afternoon with Alex Fink. And the central bankers are well aware that we are creating increasing distortions and problems and potential for financial exuberance and financial crisis, but they ignore the risks. Yeah, so I'm sure that Mr. Draghi is a very intelligent person. So he knows my criticism, but he doesn't hear it. Yeah, and one interpretation is he's convinced that I'm wrong, that I have the wrong model, and he has the right model. And the other interpretation is there's a big political interest to ignore this criticism. Yeah, and there are mainly three explanations why there's a political interest. There are two reasons why there's a political interest of central banks to ignore the criticism. Yeah. So one reason is, of course, that the information for central bankers is also incomplete. Yeah. So they don't know the natural interest rate, and that's why they make mistakes. But still, I observe that the mistake is asymmetric. Yeah. They are very fast and decisive in cutting interest rates, but they are hesitating to increase interest rates. Yeah, and if I observe such a pattern over a time period of 30 years, I might observe a specific preference for interest rate cuts compared to interest rate increases. Yeah, and then I can ask the question, what is the reason for that? Of course, central bankers would claim that they are independent. Yeah, and they only follow their specific targets, which they have defined for the central banks. We will discuss right away what the role of inflation is in this context, but they might be also influenced by somebody. Yeah, and now the question is, who is profiting from these asymmetric monetary policy stances or paths? Yeah? Because there are winners and losers. The losers we discuss on Friday, but who is profiting? There are two types of agents which profit.
Well, it's on one side, of course, the banks that get bailed out, and therefore they do not have to carry the downside risk of their investment, but can still retain all the upside potential.
Right. So first, for a long time, the whole financial sector profited a lot, yeah, because the cheap money inflated the asset prices, they inflated the credit volume, they created a lot of new business for the banks. So the banks, they really made big profit. Yeah, and when they made losses, the losses through the central bank response to the crisis were covered by somebody else. Yeah, so the financial sector, I think since 2008, you have to make a separation between different agents in the financial sectors. The banks in Europe are more regulated down and destroyed now by the central banks, but still the investment banks and the American banks will profit a lot from this, from these policies. So they make large profits, and now you can discuss if there's an informal interlinkage between central bankers and financial markets. Yeah, and then you would first learn that central banks are banks. Yeah, and concerning the stuff, I also worked for the European Central Bank. There's a lot of exchange of stuff between central banks and private banks. And you might not be surprised to hear that Mario Draghi, before coming to the European Central Bank, worked for Goldman Sachs. Yeah, and the head of New York Fed, which is doing all the operation in US monetary policy, was also working for Goldman Sachs. Yeah. And of course, there's a good justification to make them central bankers, because the monetary policy has a very strong impact on financial markets. So in order to do a responsible monetary policy, they have to understand how financial markets work. But still, if all the central bankers are previous workers or members of Goldman Sachs, you can clearly imagine what kind of monetary policy we would do. We would do a monetary policy which is in the interest of Goldman Sachs and other large investment banks. Yeah, and of course, the investment banks, they are very smart and they know best how the transmission of monetary policy works. And by the way, if central banks issue new money, the new money being issued until it ends up in the real sector of the economy, it has to go through the financial sector. Yeah, and so all newly issued liquidity is first going through the financial sector. Yeah, and there's, for instance, the Cantillon effect. Yeah, and Cantillon, I think he was a friend of Hayek, and he discussed the redistribution effects of newly issued money. And he clearly says that's in the favor of the financial sector. Yeah, because if now the ECB issues a lot of new money, it goes through the financial sector. The financial sector could buy real estate still at a constant price from A, B, C. And then the money goes into the pocket of A, B, C. And when they buy new real estate for the returns, the price has already increased. Yeah, so there is a redistribution effect in favor of the ones which are closest to the newly issued money by the central banks. Yeah, so the financial sector would always profit. Yeah, so there's a question: is there a clear separation between the financial sector and the central bank? And for the United States, this is not very clear. Yeah, so a lot of
I was wondering that if there's such a, let's say, interlinkage between commercial banks and central bank, why, for example, special operations like the one carried on by the ECB, like LTRO and so on, like this, which was basically free money for commercial banks, they were not attended at all by commercial banks themselves, and they didn't profit at all. So it seems like commercial banks actually didn't have any interest in getting this nearly free money, because it was like near to zero interest rates on that new issued money.
Yeah, so this is maybe linked to what we discussed before. Since 2008, you have a new interaction term, which is regulation. Yeah, so you have to clearly distinguish between the pre-crisis period without regulation. Yeah, so between 2003 and 2008, both in Europe and in the United States, the newly issued money was clearly at the benefit of the banks and the financial institutions. Yeah? Since 2008, this is not so clear anymore, because there's a lot of regulation which prevents risk-taking, in specific of European banks. But there are also different detrimental effects, in specific on the traditional banking business, because now the spreads which traditional banks earn, so they accept deposits and they pay interest on the deposit, and they hand the deposits out in form of credit. And for instance, Japan in the 1980s, this spread was 3.5 percentage points. Yeah. But now, as the Bank of Japan is bringing down the interest rate, the spread is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah. So the opportunity of, in specific, small and medium banks in Japan to make profit on their traditional banking business is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And they have to substitute the business via speculation in financial markets. Yeah. In specific, via speculation in international financial markets. Yeah, and here it's good to be big. Yeah, if you're a big Japanese investment bank, you know the trends in international financial markets, and you can take the right positions in international financial markets. If you're a very small Japanese regional bank, probably you have the wrong information, and probably the access to international financial markets is not is too expensive. Yeah. So since 2008, there are winners within the financial sectors and losers. Before, I think the whole financial sectors have gained a lot. Yeah? But there's a question about the separation between the central bank and the financial sector, and then, of course, yeah.
The central bank in the current model in the Euro and Federal Reserve are private institutions. Would there be a difference if they would be government-owned?
So the ECB is not a private institution. It's a public institution. And the Fed, of course, is a private institution, but the head of the Fed is nominated politically by the Congress, right? So the board is mainly influenced by politics.
But is the separation of power here beneficial, or does it create wrong incentives?
I don't see the separation of power. Yeah. One could discuss it for the Swiss National Bank, but even a large share of the Swiss National Bank is owned by the cantons and so on. It's not. I don't see most central banks as private institutions. At least the decision making is strongly controlled by the public sector. Yeah, and that brings us to the second argument. Yeah, is there a clear separation between the governments and the central banks? Yeah, and if you look on history of central banking after World War II, this separation was not there, except Germany. Yeah, so in all southern European countries, for instance, the central banks were controlled by the government, by the Ministry of Finance. Yeah, and that usually led to a situation when the governments hadn't sufficient means to finance their expenditure. They asked the central banks to print the money. Yeah, and this led, in specific in southern European countries, to high inflation. Yeah, and here there was no doubt that there's no clear separation between the government and the central bank.
So there's a paper from two researchers from the Czech central bank, I think, and they proposed that the central bank could set up wallets for private households and fill them with central bank capital money. So is that an opportunity to sideline or surpass the intermediaries?
Yes, that would be when. So nowadays in Japan, for instance, that's already helicopter money. Yeah, because all bonds issued by the government are bought by the central bank to a large extent. Yeah, and the big contrast is that the helicopter is not throwing the money on the people; it's throwing the money on the government. Yeah, and the government decides how to spend the money in its personal interest. Yeah, and this approach then would be, I think that's what they mean, but I don't know the paper, but that would be a kind of helicopter money throwing the money on the people. Yeah. And this, we will right away move to the issue on inflation. And I think this would cause inflation. Yeah. Because now the people have more pocket in the money in their pockets and they start buying. Yeah. But this kind of liquidity creation, which we are observing now, which is going through the financial intermediaries, yeah, is certainly not creating inflation. And because it's not creating inflation, it can go on forever. Yeah. So the central banks can go on printing money and injecting this money into the financial sector or in the public sector. Yeah. And then you have the question, are the central banks independent from the public sector? And the answer would be, in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, it is written that the European Central Bank is independent. Yeah? And because it's written in the treaty, the European Central Bank is independent. Full stop. Yeah? And one important feature of independence from the government is that the European Central Bank is not allowed to buy the bonds of the government, from the government. But now we observe that the European Central Bank is buying in a large-scale government bonds, maybe 2,000 billion euros worth, from third parties. And because they are buying the bonds from third parties, the governments can issue more bonds. So what is the difference? It would be cheaper to buy it directly from the third parties, from the government. Yeah.
But then the third party here again makes some profits.
Yes.
And they get the margin.
Right.
That's of course again profit for the financial sector.
Right. Yeah. So it's an additional profit for Goldman Sachs. Yeah. Because if Draghi announces to buy bonds, Goldman Sachs can lift the price. They have the bonds. Yeah. So they are buying in a large scale bonds, where the elephants now in the bond market, and the elephant can only buy from the big institutions, because only the big institutions can sell sufficient bonds and they can lift the prices.
When they buy from the third sector, like from third party, there's some kind of market incentives to buy the bonds in the first place. When just central banks buying bonds from the governments, that's just like direct funding. And when you buy from a third party, at least they do some kind of assessment about the government's ability and stuff like that. So I see there's like a distinction between those.
Yeah, there is a distinction, but the question is if this is semantics or if there's a real distinction. Yeah. So, and this we will never know. Yeah. What is true? Do they do the right strategy? Do they do the wrong strategy just because they don't know the natural interest rate? Do they serve the interest of the financial sector, or do they serve the interest of the government? Yeah, because nowadays it's very clear the governments in the south of the euro area have very high debt. Yeah. And if the ECB would stop buying bonds, Italy would be bankrupt. Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, and the ECB continues to buy bonds. Yeah, and because we are not allowed only to buy Italian bonds, we have to buy bonds of all countries. Yeah, and this implies that all countries can issue more debt. Yeah, and the debt level would increase, and the more the debt level would increase, the more the ECB would be forced to buy the bonds in order to keep the interest rates low. Yeah, so for whatever reasons, the monetary policy response is asymmetric. And monetary policy is a very convenient tool to deal with the crisis, because financial markets are increasingly irrational. Yeah, the scale of financial crisis is growing. Yeah, so somebody has to respond fast. The central bankers are the only ones who can respond fast, and there are negative costs. Yeah, because if the central banks print money, there's seigniorage. Yeah, so there are additional resources which can be spent. So cutting interest rate in response to the crisis and buying assets is a very convenient policy tool, but not policy tool. Yeah, so it's a tool of economic policy making. And 30 years ago, yeah, the downside would have been that the more loose the monetary policy is, the higher inflation would be. Yeah, but now there's no inflation. Yeah, inflation is very low. Yeah, the 2% inflation target. We have inflated the balance sheet of the ECB, and inflation is always below target. Yeah.
Isn't that due to the fact that the liquidity doesn't get into the real market? Besides like asset prices and housing prices. So if there's no more money coming to the consumers, like how is consumer prices gonna?
Yeah, I think your answer is totally right. The money which is issued by the central bank is not coming to the consumers, because otherwise they would spend. Yeah, but it seems it does not come to the consumer, and therefore the prices do not increase. And then the question is, where does the money go? So what does the central bank target?
Price stability.
And how is the price index defined? And that's written in the treaty. Yeah, the ECB has the target to maintain price stability. This is written in the treaty, full stop. Yeah. And how does now the ECB define price stability? Israel.
Well, it's considered to be a price inflation rate, an annual price inflation rate of 2% or close to 2%.
Yes, but what kind of index?
For consumer prices.
Consumer prices. Yeah. And what is in the basket?
Ordinary goods. A normal consumer would buy.
Yeah. All kind of goods consumers would buy. Yeah. Food, drinks, public transport, leisure, all kind of services, and so on. And what is not in the basket?
Prices.
Stock prices are not in the basket.
Government bonds.
Government bonds are not in the basket.
Real estate.
Real estate is not in the basket.
I'm not sure, but I think oil, for example.
Oil is in the basket.
It is.
Fuel, yeah, which you use to put in your car, so that's in the basket. One major position is missing. And it's not in the basket. Public goods, yeah, because we have no price. Highways, university education, social security issues, it's not in the basket, yeah. And now the question is, why don't we have inflation? Yeah, and there are two answers to that. So the standard answer is, of course, monetary policy has been increasingly expansionary. Yeah, interest rates have gone to zero. The central bank balance sheets have been inflated like hell. I've shown you this balance sheet of Japan that has inflated dramatically, but inflation in Japan, consumer price inflation, is very low. Yeah, and so answer number one, so standard macroeconomics, the Woodford models. Yeah, in the Woodford DSGE models, there's no money in. Yeah, there's no, it's monetary policy making without money. Yeah, there's only an interest rate there, but no money. Yeah, and the answer is inflation is so low because central banks, in a very convincing way, have communicated to the people that inflation will be low. Yeah. So I tell you, inflation will be low, 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 and you believe that inflation will be low, and because you believe that inflation will be low, you don't ask for higher wages, and if you don't ask for higher wages, the enterprises are not forced to increase inflation, and then inflation will be low forever. Yeah? And because central banks has so convincingly communicated that inflation will be low, it's low. And the central banks can use the interest rate for different targets. For instance, for stabilizing the financial sector or for stabilizing public finance. Yeah. Now they can cut interest rates to zero. They can buy government bonds as much as they want. Inflation is low. Everybody is safe. And they can use the monetary policy tools for different targets, yeah, which is financial stabilization and the stabilization of public expenditure. Yeah, and that's like heaven. Yeah, so now they can print as much money as they want to stabilize the financial sector and to stabilize government expenditure, and there are no costs. Yeah.
But isn't that an inherent flaw in the CPI approach to have this basket of goods? Because you never know exactly which goods consumers will buy. And because this is unique for each individual, can there be such a consumer price index that actually represents a more true value?
So every person has a different consumption structure. Yeah, so everybody of us. Yeah, so. But at least the statistical offices try to adjust the basket to the consumption habits of the people, yeah, of an average European, yeah, whatever an average European is. But meanwhile, we have a harmonized consumer price index, and this is adjusted, I think, every 5 years to the changes in consumption habits.
What about the products in the basket? They're changing now and then. They're changing the products in the basket when people start buying TVs or something like that. They replace the radios from the
yes,
basket.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and also when the prices go lower, people tend to buy more of them, so they will include them in the baskets. So wouldn't that cause some bias in the messenger?
No, they more or less try to eliminate all these biases.
Okay.
This is not the problem. What is the problem? Where does inflation show up?
I think the old interpretation had a smart way to come up with your point, because they define, I think, the value of money, which is represented in all prices. So they target stable money.
Say it again. I'm not sure if I fully understood.
The value of money is represented in all prices.
Yes, and not only consumer prices. Yeah, and now we observe that, for instance, real estate prices are shooting up. Yeah, so now take Germany, for instance. I don't know. Average real estate prices are increasing by 7% per year, but the rents, which are included in the basket, are only increasing by 1.2%. Yeah, because rents are controlled by the government. Yeah. And so everybody who is renting an apartment is safe, but the ones who want to buy an apartment, they experience, of course, a serious loss in purchasing power. Yeah, and this loss of purchasing power is not included in the basket. If you want to buy stocks, you have a serious loss of purchasing power, but the loss is not represented in the basket. And if you consume public goods, the prices of the public goods are increasing dramatically. Yeah, take the airport of Berlin, for instance, or the opera house in Hamburg. Yeah, or the new building of the ECB, they had a price increase of 9% per year. Yeah, but the increasing prices of public goods, which have to be, of course, paid by the citizens through higher taxes and so on, and higher contributions to the social security system, are not incorporated in the basket. So it seems to me that the inflation takes place outside the basket. People lose the purchasing power in all items which are outside the basket, and because they lose the purchasing power outside the basket, yeah, they have to substitute expensive goods by cheap goods. Yeah, so Aldi and Lidl was a small market segment in the 1970s. Yeah, and now everybody goes to discounters. Yeah, and everybody tries to get the best deal where he can get it. Yeah, because we are losing the purchasing power outside the basket, and therefore, at least in my interpretation, nowadays, the low inflation is measuring the loss of purchasing power of people rather than a stable purchasing power of the people. Yeah, that is at least an interpretation of a low inflation environment.
And that would come because basically the money which is issued by the central bank goes to commercial bank, and that is okay. But then the failure, let's say, in the system happens because this doesn't go, let's say, to the real sector, at least not, let's say, into consumer goods. But commercial banks obviously prefer to invest into, let's say, more securing or prefer to have more secure investments, and which, for example, are real estate, and therefore there is where all this money flows in, and where, let's say, inflation happens.
Right.
So while, let's say, they don't like to invest in more risky situations, or where, for example, private projects, or I don't know, new businesses and so on,
right,
which would rise on the other side, like wages or employment.
So the inflation targeting regimes, as we have it since the mid-1980s, are constrained to liquidity creation of the central banks. Yeah? But the constraint is intermediated by the financial sector. Yeah? So first they issue this money by the central bank, then they are turned over to the financial sector, and now the financial sector mainly has two possibilities. It can funnel the additional liquidity to the enterprises and to the households. Yeah? And if they do that, sooner or later inflation would increase. Yeah, because the households get more household credit, they would buy more, the enterprises would invest, there would be more demand for investment goods, and so on. There would be a shift of resources from the consumer goods sector to investment sector. There would be, in the first phase, less supply of consumer goods, and this would drive up prices. And that happened in the 1970s. And if prices would go up, the inflation target would force the central bank to tighten the liquidity provision. Yeah? And then the profit opportunities of the financial sector would be constrained. Now let's assume a scenario where the financial sector decides to funnel the money into the financial sector. Yeah? Where prices in the real estate sector shoot up, raw oil prices are shooting up based on future trade or whatever, or they fund it in the subprime market or whatever. They have a very, very large opportunity to make profits, and the constraint does not hold, because now asset prices shoot up, and the asset prices are out of the basket, which is measuring inflation. And that even gives the central banks the opportunity, if the asset price bubbles burst, the central banks can even issue more money, yeah, because consumer price inflation will not go up. Yeah, so that's a kind of unlimited line of credit. Yeah, and if you take, for instance, the European Central Bank, they started with an inflation target of below 2% in 1999, and they changed the inflation target to below but close to 2% in 2003. Yeah, and this makes a tremendous change for the implications for unconventional monetary policy making. Why? If you know the inflation rates, I tell you what the inflation rates for the euro area were since 2008, mainly between 0.9 and 1.7.
I think they can now rely on a long-term average, so they can surpass also the target for some time if they were lower below target for some time.
But this would have been the case also before. Before it was below, and now it's close to 2%.
It allows the central bank somehow to constantly tend to this 2%, therefore constantly increasing the money which is issued.
Yes, because if you have 0.9 or 1.7, it's all below 2%, and it would not justify the bond purchases of the European Central Bank. Yeah, 2,600 billion euros. Yeah, but if it's close to 2%, you could argue, as long as inflation rates are below 2%, be it 0.9 or 1.2 or 1.8, we continue to buy bonds, yeah, in order to ensure our inflation targets. And if the more the bond purchases erode the purchasing power of the people, that will bring down the inflation rate, and the European Central Bank would be deprived of the constraint. Yeah, so they could issue as much money as they want. Yeah, but they still can train on monetary policy.
I understand this point, but I mean the 2% target, which is not only the ECB, but for example the Fed as well. And I think Bank of Japan has a similar target. Has also other valid justification, I would say, because anyway, a small, let's say, a small inflation level is still considered beneficial for the economy generally, as it, I don't know, provides liquidity for investments, like I don't know, a liquid investment process, so that people are somehow brought to invest more today rather than saving the money tomorrow and so on.
I know all these justifications, but now you can match it with reality, and you can check if the justifications are still justified. Yeah, if a strong liquidity creation of the central banks are really creating growth, or if they are destroying growth. Yeah, if they ensure income equality, or if they increase income inequality. Yeah, we will discuss later on.
Yeah, that is for sure, but I think that depends not much on the target which is chosen, but more on this failure in this process of how money is transmitted to the real economy. So what we said before, basically, that the point is that commercial banks do not have any incentive to somehow with all this liquidity created into the real market, rather than investing in more safe projects as public good provision.
But if you change the construction of the basket, yeah, they put in real estate prices and stock prices in the basket, there would be higher inflation rates and a tighter constraint on the central bank. Yeah, so the construction on of the basket is crucial for the constraint of the central bank nowadays. Okay, so let's move on. So this is a great moderation. Yeah, excellent communication skills of central banks keep inflation low, and because the excellent communication skills of central banks keep inflation low, you can use interest rates and monetary policy for different targets, like financial stabilization or stimulating growth. Yeah. And we end up with an asymmetric monetary policy as represented by the Jackson-Hole consensus. Yeah, so you know in Jackson-Hole, important central bankers meet once a year, and they argue we cannot spot bubbles, that's impossible, and therefore when we have exuberance in financial markets, we cannot intervene against the bubbles, that's impossible, we just have to let it go, but when the bubble bursts, we have to intervene. Yeah. And then, of course, again, you have an asymmetric monetary policy pattern. So that's a cleanup strategy. We also, when we have to clean up, yeah, once the crisis occurs. And then this is what you have seen yesterday, the long-term downward trend in interest rates. I've shown you yesterday that this does not stop here once the interest rate level is reached at zero. The central bank balance sheets are inflated based on purchases of government and corporate bonds, yeah, and this comes along with wandering bubbles, yeah, and where a specific monetary policy shows up is not clear, yeah, so like Japan, the bubble bursts, and you have interest rate cuts by the Bank of Japan, but then the inflationary process shows up in East Asia. Yeah, while the Bank of Japan continues to issue new money in order to stabilize the domestic economy at a low inflation rate in Japan, when the inflation and the stock price bubble shows up in Southeast Asia. Yeah, so in the thinking of monetary policy making, still a domestic approach prevails, but the implications of monetary policy making, in specific of the large international central banks issuing international currencies like Japan, Euro area, and United States, the implications are global. Yeah, and Japanese monetary expansion can show up in Japan or in Southeast Asia or in China or the United States. Yeah, and once you have acknowledged, so implicitly sometimes it's acknowledged, that benign liquidity conditions lead to exuberance in financial markets, you can still argue when it's up to regulation to prevent these unsustainable developments. Yeah, and when you extend the financial supervision agencies, yeah, like in response to the European financial and debt crisis. Before, the ECB had about 1,200 employees. They moved to the new building, and in the old building, an additional employees, 1,200 employees were hired now in order to monitor the big European banks. Yeah, so we created a very big financial supervision agency. Yeah, in response to the European financial and debt crisis, and now we can scrutinize theoretically if this is promising or not. Yeah, and we build upon the observation which we have made that in the short term, of course, when a crisis occurs, the central banks can stabilize financial markets, but in the long term, new exuberance will emerge. Yeah, and it would be the task of the financial supervision agencies to prevent that new exuberance will emerge. And that is also what Minsky proposed. Yeah, and then you have to know that the financial supervisors are bureaucrats. Yeah, they are hired by the government in order to do financial supervisions. I'm a university teacher. Yeah, the university is a public institution. I'm a bureaucrat as well. Yeah, so I should function like the bureaucrats in the financial supervision agencies, and mainly we get a task attributed by the government. So we are executive organs of politics, and in contrast to the politicians, we have more expertise on doing what we are doing. Yeah? So the people in the financial market agencies, they know financial markets very well. Yeah, but the minister who is responsible for this issue, 4 years ago, he was a minister for agriculture. Now he's in charge of financial supervision, and in 3 years he might be, I don't know, responsible for health. So the ministers are not experts in the fields for which they are responsible. So the expertise is with the ministries or the financial supervision agencies. And now they are doing two things. First, they exert political decisions, but they also maximize their personal utility. Yeah, like everybody of us. Yeah. We try to maximize our personal utility, whatever this is, and this might then lead to a situation that the social utility, which is in our context a stable financial system, is not the primary concern of the bureaucrat. The primary concern of the bureaucrat is his personal well-being. Yeah? However you define that, in contrast to an investment banker, we cannot maximize our income, yeah, because usually we are fitted into certain income categories and we cannot negotiate that. But we have the benefit that we have a low risk to get jobless. So usually the government does not fire people. Yeah, I'm a public servant. A public servant means you cannot be fired by definition. And in addition, payment for public servants, for bureaucrats, is widely independent of the performance. Yeah, cannot show up at the president of Leipzig University telling her that I have a very good performance and therefore I want to have a higher salary. Yeah, that's maybe not possible. Yeah, so we all have the same high performance, and that's where therefore we get the same salary. And if we do make mistakes, usually we do not make a personal responsibility for the outcome of our decisions, for our mistakes. So yesterday there was a picture of Berlin Airport. Yeah, you might know Berlin Airport. It's a disaster. Yeah, it should open many years ago, and it does not open. And the costs are rising and rising and rising and rising because a lot of political planning mistakes were made. Yeah, for instance, by the former mayor of Berlin, Bovereit. Yeah, and there are billions of costs for the German taxpayer, but he walks away without taking any responsibility. He said, "I didn't better know that," or something like that. Yeah. So, and based on all these simplifying assumptions, we can define a principal-agent problem in financial supervision. And there is a principal and there is an agent. The agent gets from the principal a certain task to be fulfilled, and he is paid for that. Yeah. And for instance, in stock enterprises, the principal is a stock owner, and he pays the manager to maximize the performance of a stock-listed enterprise. That's a typical principal-agent relationship. Here in our game, we have a two-step principal-agent relationship, which I will show right away. Of course, we have asymmetric information. The bureaucrat about financial supervision has better information than the politician. And of course, the politician has better information than the voter. And now the bureaucrat will try to optimize his utility, and utility can be defined in different ways. So usually he cannot optimize his income, but he can optimize his power. You have a lot of power if you have a lot of people working in your division. Yeah, then you have also large prestige, and sometimes if you have a very large division working under you, you have also a higher income. Yeah, and you are usually not fully controlled by politicians. Yeah, so I'm as a university teacher, of course I have a duty to teach students, but they cannot control if I show up in the classroom, but Andy shows up instead of mine. Yeah, they cannot control that, so I can minimize my workload. So that's mainly in line with the base model of bureaucracy by Niels Cannon. And the theoretical assumptions are that the chief bureaucrat maximizes his utility by maximizing the budget of his office for many employees. And this in a way correlates with his utility of income and prestige. The politician asks the bureaucrat to provide a certain public good, in our view now financial supervision, and the willingness of the voters to pay is shared by the politicians. So the voters, of course, they want financial stability because they have stocks, they have savings in their banks, and they don't want to have the stock market collapse, and they don't want to have the banks collapsing. And that's in a way a bilateral monopoly, as we will see. And there's an asymmetric information. So here, that's the first step. There's a voter, that's in a way us. And we are not only voters, we also deposit money in the banks, and we have stocks in the best case of banks, and we pay taxes. Yeah? And we ask the politician as our agent to provide us with a stable financial sector. Yeah, that's our desire, because we don't want that our deposits are devalued or that the stocks of the banks collapse. So we elect the politicians because they promise us to provide us with a stable financial sector, and we expect them to provide a stable financial sector. Yeah, of course, politician, as we argued, has not the knowledge to supervise the financial sector. He has to do other things, and he does not have the expertise, so he asks the financial supervision agency. So the bureaucrat. Now the politician is the principal, and the agent is the bureaucrat. and the politician sends taxpayers' money to finance stuff of a financial market agency and expects the bureaucrat to provide financial stability. And now the question is, will the bureaucrat provide financial market stability in an Austrian context, if we know that from the point of view of Austrian business cycle theory, the risk is building up during the boom? Will the financial supervision agency cry alarm when the imbalances build up?
Well, it's in the interest of bureaucrats to make money during the boom to not interfere with it, so they keep the status quo.
So the bureaucrats keep the boom going, but why? Why do they keep the boom going? What would happen if you would cry alarm? You have to stop the boom.
Well,
Prevent banks.
They would lose personally.
No, they don't take the responsibility. Who would lose?
Politician.
The politician would lose. Why would the politician lose?
The voters, like, if the markets crash, the voters will be mad and they will vote for the politician again.
Maybe, maybe not.
It's not directly the crash, but if you stop the boom, so you, for example, you increase interest rates, and then it would be the voters who would perceive, let's say, a slowdown of the boom, which would lead somehow to a slowdown, for example, increase in unemployment, or just a slowdown in the increase of employment, which would resort to people just not voting the politician anymore.
Right. If bureaucrats stop the boom, the growth would slow down, there would be more unemployment, there would be less tax revenues, and the probability of a politician to be re-elected would decline. So there's a very strong interest from the side of the politician that the bureaucrat does not stop the boom. If the bureaucrat would stop the boom anyway, would cry alarm anyway, what would happen? As in the Jackson Hole consensus,
Could you say that the politician just lies off the bureaucrat? Just stops paying the bureaucrat and
no, he continues paying the bureaucrats.
Doesn't care.
Doesn't care.
According to Jackson Hole consensus, would ask, can you prove it?
Yes, they would ask a bureaucrat, could you prove it? We have high tax revenues, the banks are very robust, the enterprises invest, everything is fine, why would you cry alarm? Yeah? So you cannot prove it, and if you can't prove it, we have no reason to stop the boom. And what happens if a crisis occurs? Sooner or later a crisis hits.
They blame the bureaucrats for not telling them early enough.
They blame the bureaucrats, and how would the bureaucrat respond?
Well, animal spirits, right? It's not our fault, it's the investors.
That's the answer probably of a politician.
We need more stuff.
The bureaucrat would say we didn't have enough stuff. Yeah, we need more stuff. Yeah, so our capacity to understand the risks in the highly complicated financial sector was not enough. So you have to double our stuff. Yeah, and that's what happened in the case of the European financial crisis. We have national financial supervision agencies, and on the top of that, very expansive European financial supervision agencies were created. 1,200 people only in the ECB with very high salaries, I can tell you. Yeah? Very expensive for the taxpayer, but they would never cry alarm. Yeah, so Taiki and myself, we yesterday published a blog post on Spain, yeah? Because the Spanish banks, during the last 10 years, they took ECB money and invested that in Turkey. Yeah, and Turkey is not really a safe place. Yeah, and now it turns out that this was malinvestment. Yeah, did the ECB recognize that? The supervision agency who was in charge of monitoring the big Spanish and Italian banks who did these trades, we didn't recognize it. Yeah, and when the crisis hits, there's big economic turbulence, and the politicians can stand in front of the camera and tell the voters, we will save your savings. And the last financial crisis was Angela Merkel and Per Steinbrück's. They went in front of the cameras and told to the voters, your savings are safe. Yeah? So they were the heroes saving the savings of the voters. Yeah? So at the end of the day, both the politicians and the bureaucrats won from the crisis for not indicating the risk. And who lost?
The taxpayer.
The taxpayer, yeah, because they have to pay for it, and the markets. The perceptions of the markets, because the markets were blamed of having caused the mess. Yeah, I'm done. So I skip the principal agent problem for the banks, which is a similar one. And then I'm done because Andy has organized a lunch on the top of a book building.
Yeah,
Okay.
we want to be Dr. Schnabl,
Mach mal. Ja, ich würde keine Wertsachen, aber die Sachen können Sie hier lassen. Ja.